is about my favorite actor in his life, and it's still just like laying. It's still laying there.
Okay, so if you could please, just for the sake of helping me sort things out in my brain, if you could get into the groups I assigned you to last time, right? So if you're doing Freudian psychology, go over here. If you're doing Lacanian psychology, you're in the middle. And if you are doing Jungian psychology, over here on the...
I forgot what I was going to do. Did you email us about that?
I don't think I did, no.
I think I did Lacanian. Lacan?
Yes.
I put stars by two of them, so I looked at two of them closely, but I think I was the junior.
Yeah.
Okay, well then go with the Jungians, yep, all right. Okay. Well, let's just see where everybody falls at. Okay, so... Alright, so you guys are Freud over here. Lacan in the middle. Jung over there. Okay, and I just wanted to, I want you guys to sort yourselves immediately so I could see who was working with who, so that I don't always put you with the same people. Okay, so let me pass around the handouts for next time. And if you don't have the handout from last time, remember it is on Georgia View. You will find it in the folder marked psychoanalytic theory. So this is the folder for next time, or not the folder, the handout for next time. So what we're going to be looking at next time, you're going to be reading A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. And we are going to be looking at this particular story through a series of what are called historicist lenses. So what that means is that context is going to start mattering a lot more, right? You're gonna have to get a little bit of outside information in order to work with these particular theoretical approaches.
Is there only one paper?
What's that?
Is there only
There
one?
should be two.
I didn't get either. Well, I think I got one.
Only one.
It's the exact same one. Thank you. Nice.
All right, which one are you missing?
The one that's not Marxist.
Okay. There we go. Just take one. You don't get to keep them all. Is anybody else missing this? Everybody else has got it? Okay, everybody has got both. Everybody has got both handouts. All right. So, as I said, we're going to be looking at historicist theories next time. Now, what historicist theories typically tend to do is contextualize a text within a particular period and a particular culture, right? So you're going to be looking at the text, you're still not really worried about the author, right? What you're looking at the text as is a product of a particular set of cultural forces. So let's start by talking a little bit about Marxist criticism. Now, first off, right, before anybody goes and puts me on any stupid watch lists, I am not trying to get you all to start waving red flags and little red books around and start, like overthrowing private property and all that, right? If you want to do that on your own, great, good, go for it. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? I'm just presenting this to you as a mode of historicist reading. This is something that a lot of literary critics do. I am not trying to foist any sort of political viewpoint on you. All right, so if you are reading from a Marxist perspective, the first assumption that you make is that art is a social construct. rather than a product of individual genius. It can't be studied apart from the context in which it was created, right? Art makes no sense, according to a Marxist, outside of its context. You don't understand context, you don't understand the work of art. The form and content of any given work of art, or any given cultural practice really, are determined by the social relations, the political practices, and most importantly, the economic practices of the time and place in which this particular work was created, right? Everything ultimately comes down to economics, if you're looking at a work of art from a Marxist perspective, right? So the economic structure of any given society, a Marxist calls the base. Right. So if you live in a capitalist society, then market capitalism is your base, right? If you live in a socialist society, socialism is your base, right? And anything that's built, like any cultural formations, politics, religion, sculpture, painting, literature, music, are going to be influenced by this particular base. So cultural formations that are built on top of this base, and we'll just sort of draw a kind of city-like thing here, are called the superstructure. So to give you an example, let's look at religious practices for a moment. If we look at the structure of the Catholic Church, what does the authority structure of the Catholic Church look like? Who's at the top? Who's in charge?
The Pope.
Okay, the Pope is in charge, right? And then who is beneath the Pope?
Bishop.
Okay, yeah, cardinals, right? Cardinals who are responsible for very large territories across the world, right? And then underneath the cardinals we have bishops. And bishops are usually responsible for individual cities, right? You have a bishop, who will run all the dioceses they'll run the whole diocese in an individual city. And then underneath that bishop, what do we have? Then you have individual parish priests, right? So within a single city, within a single diocese, you have several different churches, several different parishes, each covering different neighborhoods. And a priest or a small group of priests will be responsible for that parish, depending on how many congregants there are in the parish, right? Okay, so when these when this authority structure was solidified was in the period that we usually call the Middle Ages, right? The medieval period. Now, does anybody know what the predominant economic system in Europe was during the medieval period? What it looked like? Well, okay, the church was incredibly powerful, right? And was the biggest single landowner in Europe.
Was it mercantilism or something?
Mercantilism comes along a little bit later.
Okay. I'm trying to remember.
The economic system, yeah, it was feudalism. Yeah. Feudalism was the economic system that most of Western Europe, anyway, had adopted in the Middle Ages, right? And feudalism works how? What's a feudal economy look like?
There's one person at the top, and every time you go down, he's in charge of everybody, and then below him, they're in charge of more people.
Yeah, exactly. So the king owns all the land, right? And then he divvies up land to give to the barons or dukes who are below him, right? In exchange for their support. And then those barons or dukes divvy out land to lords and earls, and those lords and earls divvy out land to knights. And then working that land are various dirt farming agrarian serfs, right? So the authority structure of the cultural formation, right, the religious organization, mirrors the authority structure of the economic base, right? Do we see how this works? Okay, so a Marxist would argue that this is how all culture works, right? That all culture is ultimately influenced by economic factors, right? So if you know what the economic system is in any given historical period, in any given place, that gives you a lot of clues as to how culture is going to shape itself, right? All right, so what else? What else do we need to go over here, right? Okay, so literature and art, all of the things that pop up in the superstructure tend to reflect the interests and values of the ruling class because they have control of the means of distributing information typically, right? So Marx and his followers call these values ideology. Right, so ideology refers to the values and beliefs of the ruling class. And because the ruling class, as I said, has control of the means of distributing information, their values become everybody's values, right? Their values become normative, and everybody ends up subscribing to them whether they really feel that way or not, right? And what else? Right, okay. So what you're going to want to look for is the contradictions that a piece reveals between this ideology, right, the way a culture thinks of itself, and the way it actually is, right? No culture actually manages to live up to its stated values and ideals. So, well, yeah. So you are going to be looking for those gaps and those disconnects, right? You're going to want to try to figure out what the underlying ideology is underneath this story, right? What are the assumed beliefs and values under which it operates? And where does the story point out our failure to live up to certain particular ideals, right? Where does that gap occur? Anybody have any questions? Okay, good, I'm glad. All right, so some of you are going to be doing what we call new historicist criticism. And if some of these sound a little bit similar to each other, it's because they are all influenced by one another, and they're all thinking about similar things. More so than was the case with the language-based theories we talked about before break. The psychoanalytic theories are all actually pretty closely related as well. So, if you're a new historicist, now, they call themselves new historicists to distinguish themselves from old school historicists. Old school historicists would go through a text and just look for references to specific historical events, right? It's like, okay, this relates directly back to the Battle of Waterloo, right? Or this is about this particular event in the Crimean War, and this is how that influences what have you, right? A new historicist is less interested in history as a set of stable, knowable facts, and more interested in history as a process of describing and talking about the past, right? So history is a process and a way of writing rather than a list of dates on a timeline. So the historian, when writing, has to use the same techniques that a fiction writer uses. Right? A historian has to choose perspective characters, has to be selective about which events to focus on, and has to give the historical moment, right, a narrative arc of some kind, right, in order for it to be convincing and compelling. So what this means is that no history that you read is ever completely neutral, objective history, right? However much the author of that history might be trying to do so, they have to use these fiction writing techniques. That's all that's available to them. So, literature and history are both then constructed out of a bunch of discourses that are woven together to tell a particular story about a given historical moment. Right, so these are the same kinds of discourses that we talked about when we discussed structuralism and deconstruction. Right, discourses are these fields of related ideas and related terms, right? So, a discourse of medicine, right? A discourse of tactics, right? A discourse of literature, things of that nature, right? So, what history really does is reflect which debates are current in the period in which the historical text itself was written, right? Not so much which debates were current in the period that the historian's writing about. A good contemporary example, like not to get anybody riled up in particular, but would be the current discussion around Confederate monuments and what they represent and to whom, right? We have competing discourses there about American history that are butting heads with each other, sometimes violently, and who don't see these structures in remotely the same way or as meaning remotely the same thing, right? So, monuments, literary texts, and all cultural artifacts are forms of cultural display. Right, what this means is that they're publicly available objects that are produced to privilege some discourse or discourses, right? So, most cultural display, according to a new historicist, is about what they call containment. Containment refers to attempts to justify and shore up the status quo, right? Attempts to justify and shore up the existing power structure. For example, if you look at William Shakespeare's plays that were written sort of about the history of the ancestors of Elizabeth I and James I, right? They tend to privilege that particular lineage, make that particular lineage look good, and make their enemies look bad, right? Those plays are written, in some ways like to ingratiate the playwright and his company with the ruling regime, right? To show the ruling regime is legitimate. However, oftentimes these forms of cultural display will contain moments, intentional or unintentional, of subversion, right? Discourses that oppose the existing power structure, that oppose whatever the ruling power is. And so what you're going to want to do to read from a new historicist perspective is look at this balance between containment and subversion, right? To what extent does the text want to shore up the ruling regime, and to what extent is it trying to poke holes in it? Yes, Leighton.
Is it possible that it has no subversion?
It would be rare that there would be no. If it's any good, if it's actually worth reading, then there is probably some tension between containment and subversion. And even things that are not intentionally subversive often are in ways that are not intentional. So you're going to be trying to look for ways in which it's subversive anyway, and ways in which it's conventional and conservative.
Okay.
And try to figure out which comes out on top, right? Okay, the last thing to note about new historicism, right? It's also sometimes called cultural materialism because a new historicist believes that a text's mode of transmission and mode of circulation matters just as much as the ideas within it, right? So the fact, for example, that, well, let me ask you this, to go back to Shakespeare as an example. How much do you guys know about the way Shakespeare's plays were produced? Or the way they were written? Did any of you know that a lot of his plays were written with collaborators?
No.
Yeah, he rarely wrote alone. It was actually abnormal for playwrights in his era to write by themselves. Most playwrights worked with collaborators. Most playwrights wrote for a specific company. And all the actors in the company were men, right? So women's parts were usually played by apprentice boys, right? Boys who were just learning the trade of acting until their voices changed and then they couldn't play women's roles anymore. This actually is a cultural materialist explanation for the relative scarcity of women's roles in Shakespeare plays. The fact of the matter is that most of the companies only ever had a couple of apprentices with them at a time. So they simply didn't have people to play women's roles. All right, so any questions about any of this? So, right, so the containment subversion thing is the really big important thing. You are going to have to do a little bit of research and digging, whether you're doing Marxism or New Historicism, on the time period and place in which A Good Man is Hard to Find was written. Yes, Leighton.
So for Marxists, it's how it goes against the culture and the way the government is set up, and in New Historicist, it's how it can be broken apart based on what it's trying to show about the society.
To an extent, yeah. I think the big difference here is that Marxism is going to be much, much more interested in how this reflects economic realities, right? How does this reflect who has and who maybe has lost economic power? Whereas a new historicist is going to be much more interested in the form of the text and in the way it would have been circulated and so on and so forth. Okay, other questions before I move on to the last one here?
It depends if I'm assigned to it or not.
Okay.
Basically.
All right. If you're assigned to it, then feel free to ask as many questions as you want. And you do have the sheet here to help you. So I have also posted. I haven't posted one for this third theory yet, but I will this afternoon. But yeah, there are sample essays that you can look at in Georgia View.
And I also had a question for the literary responses. Are those what we did with the philosophical ones?
Yeah. You're doing more or less the same thing, right? So what I want you to do is I haven't had time to rewrite the assignment sheet and repost it. Like my wife is still recovering from the surgery, so I'm essentially doing everything that needs to be done around the house and trying to get my work done in between that. So Yeah,
It's not-
I'm gonna get that rewritten tonight and reposted tonight, but essentially what you will be doing is using the theoretical lenses I'm giving you as a means of reading that story, right? And you're gonna try to come up with some kind of basic thesis or argument about that story using the theoretical lens. All right, so last one here. So third and final historicist theory we're going to be using, cultural studies. So cultural studies is not specifically about literature. It's based in anthropology, actually. And the basic argument is that every culture has a set of signifying practices in which all members participate to varying degrees. Right now, just about everything you do is, in some sense, a signifying practice. It signals things about you to others, right? What you choose to wear is a signifying practice, right? That identifies you as a member of a particular subculture or of no subculture, right? What music you choose to listen to is a signifying practice, right? What church you go to is a signifying practice, right? How you address others in everyday conversation. Even things like the shows you choose to watch on television. Things like taking a vacation, right? These are practices that tell other people things about you, right? How long your vacation is matters. Where you go on vacation matters, right? This is there's a British comedy show that I used to watch. It was called Keeping Up Appearances. It's about this woman who is firmly middle class, but wants all of her neighbors to think that she's incredibly wealthy, and connected to aristocracy. So there's an episode where she goes to the tourist office and gets a whole bunch of brochures to lay out on her kitchen table so that anyone who comes into her house thinks she's going on a big, expensive, fancy vacation, right? This would be a signifying practice. This would be an example of a signifying practice, right? Okay. So the other thing that a cultural studies approach suggests is that there's no qualitative difference between signifying practices, right? That they're all worthy of study, that there is no reason why a T.S. Eliot poem or a Shakespeare play is more worthy of study than an old episode of Alf or a professional wrestling match or a hip-hop album, right? That these are all means of cultural expression, and that what sort of things you enjoy and prefer to study or prefer to spend your time with says more about you than it does about the actual quality of the action. Yes, thank you. Right. So what you're going to be looking for if you're doing cultural studies, right? You're not so much going to be looking at this particular text as an expression of a particular time and place. What you're going to be looking at are the kinds of signifying practices that the characters engage in, right? So, what sorts of books do they read, right? What sorts of activities do they enjoy, right? What sorts of clothes do they wear? What are they trying to signal with these activities? And what might they be inadvertently signaling without realizing it? Okay, does this make sense? Everybody got it?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, great. So, what you're doing today, right? You're doing psychoanalytic readings of Bartleby, right? But
He's a weird man.
He was a great man. I loved him. He did his work.
well, remember again, because you are
It's literally all
Right.
he did.
remember that you are not psychoanalyzing Bartleby, right? You're not psychoanalyzing the character Bartleby. In part, because do we have...
Be able to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, do we have any access to Bartleby's thoughts?
Yes.
I was always waiting
Well,
for it.
then he would
The
prefer
story
not to,
ended, and I was
right?
like,
Yes.
Where is it?
I prefer not to.
Yeah, all we know about him is that he would prefer not to. So what you're going to be looking at instead, right? Instead of trying to psychoanalyze Bartleby himself, right, try to psychoanalyze the consciousness that Bartleby is filtered through for us, right? Look at the narrator, look at the perspective character, look at what his interactions with Bartleby tell us about him, right? Rather than what they tell us about Bartleby himself. Okay? All right, so go ahead, go to it.
Let me read the sheet.
Yeah, go ahead, read the sheet.